Hi there, and welcome to another episode of The Film Element. Today, I will actually be reviewing a film this time instead of just talking about general news or interviewing someone from the industry. So today's review, I will be talking about a film I just saw this Friday called Sway. And Sway is a Canadian film that was actually shot here in Toronto, not too far away from us. And I wouldn't say it's a Canadian film. It definitely tries to sort of play both sides as an American film, but with Canadian sensibilities, Canadian talent, Canadian locations. But I think the film is trying to set it in the US, mainly because one of the main characters is associated with the NFL, and obviously that doesn't happen up here in Canada specifically, at least with the NFL draft. So before I begin, I'm just going to give a synopsis from IMDb. After his brother goes missing, a black community leader who has it all sees his life spiral out of control. Within hours, he's blackmailed by a strange woman, and a murder tests how far he will go to protect the ones he loves. So this film was directed by two people, Charlie Hamilton and Zach Ramalan, and it stars Emmanuel Kabongo, Michelle Morgan, and I would say another standout performance is by the Lovell Adams Gray, who ends up becoming a pretty main character, especially near the end of the film. So this film was interesting. I have a lot of connections to it. First, I'll get into that before I give my review of the film or talk about it. I feel a little connected to this film because a lot of people that were involved in it are people that I've worked with in the past. Zach Ramalan, one of the directors, is actually someone he and I have corresponded over the past couple of years, and I've always really enjoyed his content and the stuff that he directs. He does a lot of stuff on YouTube and does a filmmaking vlog that is very popular and is very well produced and well made. Charlie, I'm unfortunately not as familiar with, but I feel like he and I have crossed paths, just missed each other at different events over the past decade or so. So I know that he's also been a prominent feature in the Toronto film industry. And then the person that I'm probably most connected to on this film is the executive producer and cinematographer, which is Chris Moresby. Now, if you've listened to or watched this podcast before, you know that I've mentioned Chris before as a great cinematographer that I've had the pleasure of working with on, I would say, 3 of my projects and about 4 or 5 overall. I met Chris, I actually never even officially met him until a couple of years ago, but I would say about 2018, he hired me, I think from a Facebook post, to edit a Nigerian Canadian co-production that was called Clash, and I was brought in after the film had already been filmed, but he recommended me to the director and star of the production, Pascal Atuma. Sorry, I don't know why his last name suddenly left my brain there. So Pascal Atuma, he was the star and director of this film called Clash that Chris shot, and then for whatever reason, I don't remember it now because it's been so many years, he brought me in to be the editor. So I went on my own journey as the editor, helping deliver the film, which eventually made its way onto Netflix. And that was my first Netflix production. And it did very well there. And then he and I actually came back together with basically the same situation. We did another Nigerian film a few years ago. Pascal had hired me on to not only be the editor, but he wanted me to be the assistant director as well. And Pascal was directing again and starring in it, but he just wanted someone that he felt knew his way around directing a scene, holding a production together. So that gave Chris and I an opportunity, because we had actually never met until that point several years later, and Chris and I started working together on this film, which is called Imported Wives. I don't know where that one's going to end up. I'm not sure if it's going to be on Netflix yet, but it had its premiere in Africa, and I think did very well over there in cinemas, and maybe it's on some streaming sites there. I'm not quite sure. That one was a little more recently, about a couple years old. And so anyway, Chris and I worked on that film together pretty closely because Pascal was in so many scenes, so he would rely on me specifically to sort of guide him and keep everything moving. So I would collaborate a lot with Chris, and Chris was very generous, and he and I would go back and forth on how to figure out scenes. So we discovered pretty quickly that we had a very good working relationship. And not only that, we were going through this pretty intense production together. So I think it just bonded us naturally. I bonded with a lot of people on that production because it was so intense and there was so much to take care of. And there was so much on our shoulders. So, but it was a great learning experience, that one, Imported Wives. So anyway, why are you talking about that, Mike? Okay, I'll get back to what I was, where this all comes from. So Chris did a similar thing on this production of Sway. He was one of the executive producers and the cinematographer. So he brought his gear, he shot it, and when I saw it on Friday in the movie theater, so they had a premiere. They were actually able to get this film into 2 movie theaters, at least in the GTA. I don't know if they're going to expand it further across Canada. So they have it playing in Morningside in Scarborough, and then with a movie theater that I'm more familiar with from my days of living downtown is Yonge-Dundas. So there's a Cineplex at the Yonge-Dundas Square, or Suncofa Square. I don't know. I don't remember what it's supposed to be called. But anyway, at that movie theater, they premiered Sway, and it had, I think, 4 screen times a day right now, and they said it would be going on for a week. So if you haven't had a chance to see it and you want to, and you're in the area and you want to check it out, I would definitely recommend looking up a time that works for you and going and checking it out. So let's talk about the movie. Now that we've talked about all the peripheral stuff that doesn't have anything to do with you, it just has to do with me and why I showed up. So essentially I went to go support the film, and I had seen trailer and footage. They had been talking about this film, Zach specifically, that's who I knew was connected to it, and he had been talking about this film for a couple of years. I believe they shot it in 2024, and now it was premiering here in 2026. And I think I don't want to talk too much about this in case this is information that they don't want out there, but this is also what they said. So, it wasn't told to me in private. I'm going off of what I saw on YouTube, specifically from Zach and other people. But the film was a very low budget, almost micro budget film that was self-financed. It didn't have a studio or any sort of telefilm or grant funding. Maybe it did afterwards, but from what I understand, at least at the beginning, they put their own money into it, which is admirable and, in my experience, very relatable, because that's unfortunately most of the times how I've operated. Everything I've done has been self-funded, wrapped around favors and, volunteer work from great people. A lot of people that I owe something to, or they owe me, or, we go back and forth. And that's the great thing sometimes about operating in the film industry, in your local film industry. So anyway, this was a micro budget, I guess you would say, thriller drama. It's a chamber film, which means it mainly takes place in one location, and it takes place in I guess you would say, penthouse in Toronto. Like, I very much recognize it as Toronto, but I think they're trying to sort of code it as maybe Brooklyn or the nicer side of the Bronx. I'm not quite sure. Or maybe it's not. They don't mention the American city it actually takes place in. There's a lot of sort of made up neighborhoods. Like the names of the neighborhoods are made up. so you can't quite, you're like, is this Chicago? It doesn't feel like it's the West Coast or the South, so I guess it's maybe Chicago, Philadelphia, New York. But yeah, I don't think it's supposed to be Toronto. Anyway, the story follows Sway, played by Emmanuel Kabongo. Emmanuel, I apologize if I'm not saying your name properly. Who I believe is associated with the NFL. His brother is in the NFL draft and is about to be a top 5 pick. He wakes up. Things aren't what they seem. Very Hollywood Boulevard. He wakes up. He feels that he's been drugged. And then he has to figure out everything that's going on. And I don't want to get into spoilers, but things quickly spiral out of control. Now, what's great right off the bat about Sway is that it gets you right into the action. There's actually no backstory. You learn everything just through the situations and the dialogue that's going on. And Emmanuel specifically does a really good job of portraying sort of that angst and confusion that not only does he feel, but we feel, because we don't know what's going on. We're hearing crazy music. We're hearing a lot of commotion. We can see this man, Emmanuel, is discombobulated. He's woken up. He's seemingly been drugged. He doesn't seem to understand what has happened. So he and the audience are piecing it together ourselves. Sort of like, The Hangover. But a lot more intense than that. And then one thing that sort of wraps the film around and sort of gives it gravity and centers it is this interview that his character is doing with an actress named Michelle Morgan. Unfortunately, I don't remember the character's name that she plays, but very quickly you see that Michelle Morgan is an incredible talent, and as soon as she starts talking, you pay attention. There's just something about her delivery and the way that she portrays this interviewer that's captivating. And I don't know how they found her. I don't know if she's a friend of the production or if they went through a very straightforward casting session, but she's obviously a revelation, and you can't really picture anyone being more perfect for that role. And through this interview, we get to know Emmanuel's character, Sway, but we also slowly understand that this interviewer is pushing him, and is pushing him on a level that doesn't really make sense for the quote-unquote magazine that you would think would want to do a profile on the brother of an NFL draftee, right? So things start to spiral a little bit, and Sway suddenly starts to find himself in trouble with people from the night before, his brother and his associates, and people he allegedly owes money to. Now, hopefully I'm not giving too much away. I think most of that is in the trailer, and I will have a spoiler section near the end because I want to talk about the third act specifically. But I think what's great about this film is that the dialogue is so sharp and it's so well performed. I would say very specifically during the interview sections. I don't know what it was, especially those earlier interview moments. So what happens is that they would do an interview, something would happen, Sway would get up, deal with it, then he would come back, try to continue the interview, and I think that happened about 3 or 4 times throughout the film. And then obviously it builds up to a big moment that, clearly makes sense in the third act and part of the climax. So I found that I was the most into the film, especially during those interview moments. And that's not an easy feat to pull off because it's just 2 people sitting in chairs talking to each other. And that can get a little tough after a while, but I think if it's written as smartly as most of this film was, it can sort of keep you captivated. And on top of that, you have these 2 really great actors pushing and pulling, and especially Emmanuel Sway is looking at his interviewer And we're not quite sure if he believes her or if he trusts her. And I think the way that builds up gets more and more interesting as the film goes along. On top of that, there's a lot of really great... It reminded me of the film Phone Booth, which I might be dating myself now. I think that came out in like 2002 or 3, or maybe even earlier than that, where the whole thing takes place in a phone booth with Colin Farrell. And everything happens through the phone. There's been similar movies that have done something along those lines. The most prominent example I can think of is Locke with Tom Hardy, where everything takes place in his car and his Bluetooth phone. There's a Jake Gyllenhaal one. I can't think of the name of it right now. Anyway, so this is a well-known genre and can be pretty effective, especially if the acting is really solid. Acting, directing, all that stuff. I mean, that feels like par for the course. But if you can nail those and nail a tight script, you can keep that stuff compelling, because it is hard to watch those things after a certain amount of time, especially in a feature film when you're getting up to 80, 90, and 100 minutes and you're keeping things really contained. You have to have a really good script and really good actors to sort of keep you hanging in there. And yes, that was the great strength of Sway. From what I understand of the behind the scenes videos that Zach specifically has been posting, Zach Ramalan, he helped Chris shoot it, or I guess you could say he was a B camera to Chris's A camera. Chris, the cinematographer / executive producer. So from what I understand, Zach used a different camera, I believe the FX3. He might, I should have looked that up, which camera he used. I know Chris used the Arri Alexa 35 and he had his lenses, and then Zach had this second camera, which I believe was the FX3, but I might get corrected. Anyway, so he was a little more nimble probably than Chris. And when you're shooting in a contained space, I can understand the need not only to get more angles, but to be a little more flexible than an Arri Alexa 35, which is a giant camera that you have to lug around, especially with the lenses on it as well. You know, you throw that on your shoulder and we're talking 60 pounds easy. And you do that for an 8-minute take, oof, you know, you're probably going to have to sit down the rest of the week. So Zach shot with this other camera and he had a stabilizer. I'm not sure exactly which stabilizer he used, but he got some really great angles and definitely switched up, you know, conventional shots that most people would probably use in a film like this. And I'm sure, from what I understand of what they said during the Q&A on Friday, they only had about 7 days to shoot this, which is just an insane amount of work for a 90-minute plus feature. You want at least, I mean, nowadays they're really trying to cut shoot days down just to get stuff done and in the can, but you want to at least have about 14 days. So to do that in only half the amount of time is extremely impressive, and I think they came up with great ideas to sort of help that along. Like I was talking about with Zach's camera, it offered another angle so that, you know, fortunately you have two cameras shooting one scene, and then you don't have to shoot that scene ideally twice as long. Although a lot of people would argue two cameras can be tough sometimes because it might sound convenient, but then you have to spend a lot of time lighting, angling, and finding the right, you know, position, A, that makes sense to even use, and B, to make sure that you're not in each other's shot, right? And not only that, but okay, I'm shooting this way with one camera and I want to shoot this way. Now you have to light both, right? And then when you light both, okay, is this light now in this camera's image, or is a light pole now in this image, right? So it can become quite daunting. Regardless, who cares? They obviously knew what they were doing, and the film looked spectacular because of that. And it's obvious that this film meant a lot to the filmmakers. They've been pushing this, like I said, for about 2 years. I know it's gone through, trying to find different distributors, but it's also had a great film festival run, which is what you want, especially when you want to push something into a movie theater. Even if you're getting a limited screening, you still need butts and seats. That's obviously very important for any movie theater. And it's important for the hype of the film afterwards, and then where it ends up in streaming or VOD or any of those other platforms. Sway was great. I think what really added to it was that they would do these shots of more downtrodden neighborhoods, and basically the projects. They were trying to portray the projects. Like I said, I don't know if this is supposed to be Brooklyn, Chicago. My guess would be Brooklyn or Philadelphia, but they might not have an answer for that at all. So they would have these shots, sort of cutaways that they obviously shot on a different day, with different casts mostly, and got these really great angles, these high angles and low angles of all these great buildings, these apartment buildings, and it really filled in the backstory of all of these characters who are going through something. And I thought a lot of those shots were some of my favorite shots in the film. All you need is a little cutaway of some slow-mo of some characters, reuniting, and it just conveys so much more. And I think when you're doing a chamber film, especially as intense of a chamber film as I felt that this one was, where so much backstory is important, it was great that they had that footage. And if I'm being honest, I think they needed more of that footage, but I also understand that, with budget constraints and other limitations, they could only do so much. But I think when you get shots that good, it's like, can you give me more? I would love to see more. So that's how I felt about the film, non-spoilers. I think I'm going to speak in spoilers. So if for some reason you feel the Venn diagram of someone who's listening to me but hasn't seen Sway, but is listening to this review, but doesn't want the ending to be spoiled, if you somehow fall into that, then I guess turn this off, because I'm about to spoil the end of Sway. Yes, so for a film that had this incredible momentum and really became this pressure cooker or a powder keg, mainly anchored by Emmanuel's really intense performance. He's answering phones from bad guys. He's trying to calm his wife down, who feels that her house is being attacked, or at least surveilled by really terrible people. And then on top of it, he's being blackmailed by a woman he woke up to that morning, and he doesn't know who she is, where she came from, or what happened. But regardless, she's blackmailing him and trying to destroy his marriage. And on top of that, he's trying to manage this interview with this woman, again played by Michelle Morgan, who's also testing and pushing him and trying to get him to sort of get in a gotcha moment and really pull at the strings of his past, and sort of trying to undo all the positivity he brags about in this interview and sort of builds his career on. So all of that really starts getting going. The Michelle Morgan character especially starts pushing him. And then we enter the third act, and I think for me personally, and I've spoken to other people, and some people don't really agree with me on this, and others might, whatever. I thought the third act was sort of where I unfortunately fell off a little bit. And I can speak on this because I actually did a film. I've talked about this in pretty much every podcast. I'm probably going to talk about it as much as I can because I need to promote it. But I did a film called Back Pay, which I If you listen to this podcast consistently, you've definitely heard me talk about it. Which was also executive produced by Chris Moresby and shot by him as well. So again, I feel a sort of spiritual kinship to this film, Sway. Very similar themes at points. Ours is not as much of a chamber film, but I've had sales agents argue it is, but I would push against that at least a little bit. Whereas Sway to me is much more of a traditional chamber film. It definitely lives in one location a lot longer than my film. So I have there's similar themes, so I feel very connected, and that's why I think my opinion might be biased, or even maybe I have even more insight than other people would. But I would say, going back to Sway and this third act, I really enjoyed the turn that Michelle Morgan's character takes, and more importantly, the turn that the Richie character takes. And Richie, I want to get his name right because he's another standout in the film. Lovell Adams Gray. He does an incredible job playing this character named Richie, who in the beginning we assume is just some goon or assistant to Emmanuel's character Sway, and then we find out he's actually, well, I guess he's not the villain, because it turns out in some ways Sway is kind of the villain, instead of the protagonist, or at least the guy that we root for. So he and Michelle Morgan's character make a real turn in the climax of the film. And it becomes this pretty long interrogation scene of the two of them sort of grinding out Sway and Emmanuel's character. And Emmanuel's doing an incredible job, very emotional. Tears are coming as sort of his life is unraveling. Michelle becomes very intense. She was this sort of affable, enjoyable interviewer, someone that you would see on 60 Minutes or whatever, and then she sort of becomes scary. And it's really powerful and really interesting to watch. I think what sort of fell apart for me a little bit as that scene was going on is it's very long, and it's just three characters in one position all talking to each other. Two are sitting and Richie is standing. And on top of that doesn't bother me that much, but I think what sort of loses the spice is that they are talking about characters in their neighborhood and from their lives that we're getting vague references to as the film is going along, but we don't know who officially is what and who did what. And when you don't have like a visual connection, at least enough to these characters, they get mentioned and mentioned and mentioned, and then I'm like, am I supposed to have an emotional connection to this guy that they keep mentioning over and over again? Because I don't know who he is. And they show some quick flashbacks of the night in question. Obviously there's a night in question where someone is murdered and then someone else is murdered to sort of cover up because they believe they saw something, and all that stuff is great, but they shoot it, and it's tough because they shoot it at night and they're all sort of in the same hooded clothes, and there's not, in my opinion, enough storytelling juice to help you anchor to which character is which, what did they do, and why is that relevant, at least on an emotional level. Again, I feel that I've talked to at least one or two other people and asked if they had a similar reaction, and at least one of them said no, but maybe I didn't go that in depth with them about it. But overall, I think despite that and sort of the third act, letting me down a little bit, I think what this team was able to put together was really well done. The editing was incredible. The acting was great. A lot of the writing and the dialogue was pretty sharp, which is what you want. And it kept up a really nice pace. You know, I want to give an extra shout out to the composer, Michelle Osis, who is somebody I've worked with before, and so I know how good she is. And I thought that the score did a really good job at sort of keeping up that intensity and that pace. Because a lot of films, especially at this budget, you just never know what you're going to get with the music. And a lot of people can fall down on that. They don't know, they keep it too flat for too long. They don't know how to pitch and peak and rise and, you know, really play with the moments. But I thought Sway did an incredible job at sort of hitting the emotional beats with the music and not just, you know, throwing something down, some sort of ambient bed that would just last the whole scene that, you know, would sort of regulate your emotions and not really get you in or out of the scene. Which to me, I believe that is important. You don't always need music, but if you're going to use it, it has to be done properly and you have to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. And I thought the filmmakers of Sway did an incredible job doing that. And I think Sway is an important moment for Canadian film because especially these days with, you know, threats of tariffs or whatever it even means, you know, and not only that, but tough economic times. Are people buying features? Are they buying Canadian content? Who knows? Is there a market for it? Can we compete? Can we compete on the world stage? I think when you see stuff like this, it gives you more confidence because, as they say, they spent a lot less money than almost any production would spend. I don't know what the exact number ends up being. They say $30,000. I think that's impossible. And I'm sure maybe one of them would hear that and argue with me. But maybe $30,000 for the production, or maybe not. Who knows? But that's good. That's what you want. You want people to say that's impossible. You must have spent more. You don't want people to hear your number and go, "Really? You spent that much?" You know, you don't want that response. So I think it's really important that they're able to spend that kind of money. Even, I'm sure a lot of favors are being called in and some people are volunteering time because it obviously was a big production. According to the behind the scenes, there's a lot of people working on that thing. So they had to feed and transport and take care of everyone that worked there, that was on that set. So I think it's important that they are able to pull off something of this high quality for that budget. I think that sends a message out there that Canadian filmmakers especially can compete on that level at that small of a budget. I've maintained for a long time that despite what the US believes about itself, I consider Toronto, I don't know Vancouver's film industry network nearly as well, but I always maintain and argue that Toronto is probably one of the best cities in the world for filmmaking. You have the resources, you have the city, and you have the talent. And there's a lot of talented filmmakers that live and work in Toronto and around Toronto. And it's not talked about nearly enough or recognized, in my opinion. But to me, they can compete with New York and LA. Can they surpass them? Probably not. But I think they're definitely in the conversation of top 3 in North America, I would argue, but certainly top 5 world. Maybe it's us, Hong Kong, Paris, maybe. And that's very anecdotal. I don't have any real evidence to back any of that up. But yeah, so I think it's really important that Sway was given this opportunity and that it's out there doing its thing. And I really hope that people check it out. If you can't check it out in a movie theater in Scarborough or at Yonge-Dundas, I hope that when it hits VOD and it hits streaming that you check it out, rate it, vote for it, you know, and then when it's on those platforms, put it in your watch list. I think stuff like this is really important to support. So yeah, that's my review of Sway. Congratulations to the team on their premiere. And that's all I got.